Everyone remembers the great science fiction movies of the 1950s. The Day the Earth Stood Still, The War of the Worlds, Forbidden Planet. These are the films that defined an era. But before any of them, one movie took a gamble Hollywood wasn't sure would work. No aliens, no monsters, no flying saucers. Just four men, a rocket, and the radical idea that audiences might take science fiction seriously. This is the story of the forgotten film that helped open the door to one of the greatest decades science fiction ever had. Today, science fiction is one of Hollywood's biggest genres. But that wasn't always the case. Before 1950, science fiction existed mostly on the fringes. There had been landmarks, A Trip to the Moon in 1902, Metropolis in 1927, and Things to Come in 1936. But they were exceptions. Hollywood still had little reason to believe science fiction could become a dependable mainstream genre. By the late 1940s, however, something was changing. The atomic bomb had altered the world. Germany's V-2 rocket had shown that machines could reach the edge of space. Scientists and engineers were openly discussing the possibility of leaving the Earth. And slowly, the moon began to look less like fantasy and more like a destination. One man who understood that shift was George Pal. Pal had already built a reputation as an innovative animator and filmmaker, but he believed audiences were ready for something Hollywood had rarely attempted: a serious science fiction film grounded in real science. The problem was that belief and financing were two very different things. Pal wasn't working from the safety of a major studio system. By 1949, he had arranged a two-picture deal with the independent Eagle Lion Films, with Pal reportedly putting some of his own money into the venture. And here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. One of those films was The Great Rupert, a warm, conventional comedy about a struggling family and a dancing squirrel. The other was an expensive Technicolor film about four men flying to the moon. Guess which one looked like the safer bet? Destination Moon was the speculative project, the film that could lose money if audiences refused to take space travel seriously. The Great Rupert was expected to be the more dependable picture, the kind of conventional entertainment that could help protect the investment if Pal's moon movie failed. But that isn't what happened. The safer film failed to become the success Pal had hoped for. The movie that looked like the dangerous bet became the one audiences wanted to see, at a time when Hollywood still wasn't sure serious science fiction could sell. George Pal had backed two movies. The conventional one was supposed to provide security, the science fiction film was the gamble, and the gamble won. But success alone doesn't explain why Destination Moon connected with audiences. George Pal wasn't just asking moviegoers to watch four men fly to the moon. He was asking them to believe that it could actually happen. And to pull that off, he would have to build a future nobody had ever seen. Even before production began, there was a huge problem facing George Pal and his team. They were trying to show audiences what a journey to the moon might look like at a time when no human being had ever even seen Earth from space. There were no NASA photographs to study, no astronaut footage, no Apollo missions. Even the sight of a man floating weightless inside a spacecraft belonged entirely to imagination. So, Pal did something unusual. He surrounded the production with people who had already been thinking seriously about tomorrow. Rather than rely on Hollywood guesswork, Pal brought in experts who had spent years considering what space travel might actually require. Among them was science fiction author Robert A. Heinlein, whose 1947 novel Rocket Ship Galileo had already imagined a journey to the moon. Heinlein co-wrote the screenplay and served as a technical advisor, helping ground the film in engineering instead of fantasy. Another crucial contributor was artist Chesley Bonestell. Long before NASA images existed, Bonestell painted detailed visions of the moon and planets, giving millions of Americans some of their most convincing early visions of other worlds. Bonestell's lunar landscapes in Destination Moon are strikingly similar to real photographs taken nearly 20 years later. Without modern technology, he relied on telescopes, scientific knowledge, and imagination to capture the feeling of standing on another world. The preparation lasted more than a year. According to production records preserved by the Academy, the filmmakers consulted military rocket engineers and scientists from Caltech, while photographs from Palomar Observatory helped to shape the film's vision of the lunar surface. Pal's concern with credibility even extended to the cast. Instead of filling the picture with major stars, he deliberately chose lesser-known actors, worried that familiar faces might distract audiences from believing the mission itself. Full-scale spacecraft sets allowed the actors to move naturally, while miniatures, matte paintings, and practical effects created a convincing journey through space. Every detail had to be carefully planned and executed. There was no digital safety net. Perhaps the most remarkable is that all of this was created before the space race even began, before any human being had been launched into space. And that commitment to credibility didn't stop with the sets. It became the story itself. Instead of rushing into action, the film carefully explains how a lunar mission would work. Financing, design, fuel, and weight all matter. These details don't slow the story, they are the story. There was still one problem though. Even if the science was sound, most moviegoers had no idea how a rocket could actually reach the moon. So the filmmakers called in an unlikely expert, Woody Woodpecker. In a specially created animated sequence, Woody explains the basic principles of rocket propulsion in terms an ordinary audience could follow. It's playful, a little strange, but remarkably effective. The launch itself is tense and methodical, emphasizing engineering over spectacle. Once in space, the film finds suspense in realism, weightlessness, limited oxygen, and the dangers of the vacuum. Today, these ideas may seem familiar, but in 1950, they were groundbreaking. Destination Moon treated the moon not as fantasy, but as a challenge waiting to be solved. Watching it now, some details naturally feel outdated. The film didn't predict everything correctly, and parts of its lunar science would soon be overtaken by reality. What remains impressive is how seriously it tried to think through the problems. As the astronauts approach the moon, space is treated as a real environment governed by physics. Weightlessness isn't a spectacle, it's a challenge. Objects drift, movement becomes awkward, and every action requires careful planning. Modern audiences are used to seeing astronauts float in space, but in 1950, this was entirely new. The idea of living and working in zero gravity was still just theoretical. The film also recognizes that space is dangerous. There are no aliens waiting for them, no creatures hiding in a crater. The threat isn't a monster, it's mathematics. Fuel is limited, oxygen is precious, and even minor failures can be fatal. The realism reaches a peak when the crew realizes they don't have enough fuel to return to Earth. Instead of a miraculous fix, they rely on engineering, calculating weight and discarding equipment to lighten the ship. Perhaps the film's most impressive prediction is emotional. When the astronauts step onto the lunar surface, the moment is quiet and awe-filled. There are no hidden civilizations, only silence and the realization that humanity has reached somewhere it has never been before. 19 years later, when Neil Armstrong actually walked on the moon, some of that same quiet sense of awe would become real. Destination Moon didn't just imagine how space travel might look, it captured something of how it might feel. It would be easy to give Destination Moon too much credit. Hollywood was already changing. The Cold War had begun. The atomic bomb had altered how Americans thought about science. Reports of flying saucers were appearing in newspapers, and the possibility of space travel no longer seemed completely absurd. So no, one movie did not create the science fiction boom by itself. But Destination Moon arrived at exactly the moment Hollywood needed proof. Proof that audiences would buy a ticket to serious science fiction. Proof that the genre could attract adults. Proof that an ambitious futuristic production could earn critical respect. Science fiction no longer had to live in the Saturday matinee. And the gamble paid off. The evidence appeared almost immediately. At New York's Mayfair Theater, Destination Moon during its first week took in one of the theater's bigger weeks at the time. Variety called the opening a smash. The film followed with another strong second week, and its run remained strong into the weeks that followed. By the end of the year, it had become Eagle Lion Classic's highest-grossing film of 1950. And the recognition didn't stop at the ticket window. At the 1951 Academy Awards, Destination Moon won for special effects and received a nomination for color art direction. For a genre still widely associated with serials, pulp adventures, and children's matinees, the message was becoming difficult to ignore. Serious science fiction could sell. And then came 1951. Within a year of Destination Moon, a remarkable wave of major science fiction films was reaching American screens. The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Thing from Another World. Soon came The War of the Worlds, Forbidden Planet, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and dozens more. Those films weren't simply copies of Destination Moon, and the boom had many causes. Some were already in development. The same cultural forces reshaping post-war America were pushing science fiction toward the center of popular culture. But Destination Moon stood at the leading edge of that wave. George Pal had already shown that audiences would pay to see science fiction treated seriously. History doesn't always reward pioneers with lasting recognition. Sometimes they're celebrated for generations. Other times, they're overshadowed by the very success that they helped create. Destination Moon falls into that second category. Despite its innovation and influence, it gradually faded from public memory. Ask most viewers to name a classic 1950 sci-fi film, and you'll hear titles like The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, or War of the Worlds. These films are still iconic, while Destination Moon is often overlooked or completely forgotten. Part of the reason is simple. It succeeded too well. The genre quickly became bigger, louder, stranger, and more spectacular. Beside the colorful worlds and larger-than-life threats that followed, Destination Moon's 4 men in a rocket began to look almost restrained. Reality also played a role. When the film premiered in 1950, a trip to the moon was pure imagination. 19 years later, Apollo 11 made it real. In a strange way, Destination Moon became a victim of the future it helped audiences to imagine. What once felt like bold speculation became historical fact. For later audiences, the film no longer represented the future. It became a relic of the past. Watching Destination Moon today isn't really about judging its accuracy. It's about stepping back into the mindset of 1950, when human spaceflight was still a distant dream, and nobody knew whether the moon would be reached in a decade, a century, or ever. When the lights dimmed and that rocket lifted from the screen, audiences could spend 90 minutes believing the impossible might actually happen. That sense of wonder is difficult to recover today because we know how the story ends. But in 1950, the future was still unwritten. Today, Destination Moon could look like a modest little film from another age. The rocket looks dated. Some of the science missed the mark. And less than 2 decades after its release, men actually walked on the lunar surface and turned its greatest fantasy into history. But that may be exactly why the film still matters. Because for 90 minutes, it lets us return to a time when nobody knew how the story would end. A time when no human being had seen the Earth from space. When the moon was still unreachable. And for those of us who were young when the real space age began, maybe that is the hardest part to explain now. That there was a time when none of this had happened yet. When tomorrow was something artists, writers, and scientists had to build in their imaginations before the rest of us could believe in it. Destination Moon may not be remembered like the day the Earth stood still or Forbidden Planet. It may never receive the recognition those films enjoy. But in 1950, before the aliens landed, before the saucers filled the skies, before Hollywood discovered just how big science fiction could become, there was one small group of filmmakers who looked up at the moon and said, "We could go there." And for the first time, a lot of people sitting in the dark believed them. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to help me keep these great films of the past alive, subscribe, share this video with a friend, or consider becoming a channel member. This is Rich from Rerun Zone. Until next time, have a good night.